the goal for today is to kind of impart the basics, and more or less this is going to be a brain dump on you all to share what I found to be some winning strategies with user stories, some things that are out there in the industry, and generally, well, my experience. They're deceivingly simple. We're going to jump right into what they look like. First, I'll give you my email. If you have any questions after the fact, feel free to contact me. I'll do my best to get back to you. So a user story is a technique for expressing requirements. Like I said, I've been using them for a few years, and they work pretty well. In a second, we'll go over what they're not, but as a point of starting, a user story has a really simple format. So as a role, I want to feature so that business value. So they really kind of start off there. I also like to boil down the feature when I'm writing stories either in a tool or on a card with a title that is just the feature. I think you'll find when you get a little deeper into that, sometimes the role and the so that can be kind of dropped or implicitly understood in a long kind of mature team. But when you're getting started, I would recommend kind of sticking to this format. All right, so that's what we're starting with. So say we'll pick the typical bad example of a bank teller system, right? So we can say, as a bank teller, I want to make deposits so that bank customers can save money. Pretty simple thing. Now the idea is that this story is actually written by, ideally, a bank teller. We'll get a little bit deeper into who, some of the compromises you have to make in the real world. But we know what we're trying to do with the software. When a developer looks at this, I have to go to my account object and make a deposit method. And the bank teller knows what they're going to get out of the mix. So at its heart, the user story kind of becomes a conversation starter between the development team and the ultimate consumer of this feature. It's a little different than maybe some techniques for requirements we've seen in the past that are more technical or that are more ceremonial, trying to express everything up front, get it right, and put it down there. So how this fits into the larger context of Agile, and then some of the mechanics of stories and how they work in iterations and releases and such. I just want to throw this slide up. It's a standard slide I always show. This is my opinion. This is my path. Your mileage may vary. So one of the things in agility that I think is really, really important, one of the manifesto statements, is this notion of responding to change over following a plan. And user stories, for me, bring me closer to this value. Specifically, the idea that we're going to start with just enough information to be able to maybe derive an estimate, or just enough information to get started on something and know that we can complete it in our iteration, whether that's a week, 2 weeks, 30 days, however you're doing it. So it's kind of an important idea. The user story isn't a fully expressed or baked spec. It is enough to get started, enough to be sure we can get done. I'm going to let this one go. But in critical path management, and typically this is a screenshot from a Microsoft project. There's this notion of tasks, right? And we are going to have this test visit, or we're going to research power system components. These don't necessarily express business. A user story does. A user story says, here's the feature, and this is why we need this feature, and this is who the feature is for. So there's a fundamental paradigm shift. When I think about building things, software, based on a very task or granular level, it conjures this weird notion of, this is a picture, an architectural drawing from Louis Kahn, who imagined building a building from the top down, which is a completely absurd idea. I mean, has artistic merit, but not practical. And tasks for me are, likely you have a project manager developing all these tasks. If it's a good project manager, and even like a traditional, CPM kind of environment, they may reach out to develop this work breakdown structure, but it's tasks. We're approaching a problem from the wrong angle. We're approaching it from a too granular angle when we don't necessarily know what we're trying to deliver, or we're approaching it from the how rather than the what. So Agile and the various Agile flavors out there give us, a nice framework for biting off little chunks. This is an image that expresses kind of the standard Scrum lifecycle or XP lifecycle, where we have this whole big product backlog, everything we want to get done, and we have things that we bring into our iteration or sprint, and in that time we get them to a potentially shippable state. That's great, but what's in the backlog? I know 6 or 7 years ago when I started with Agile, started with Scrum, we just had these things called backlog items. And more or less they were expressions of task. Do this. Oftentimes to the point of, here's how to do it. And I think what user stories give us is a means of putting small items in the backlog that everyone can kind of understand, everyone can kind of see, and then we decompile it when we get to the iteration point. Then we start thinking about tasks. Then we start thinking about our design and how we're going to make this software happen in the context of the development team. Business users generally don't care, but they can see that story progress through its various states, whether it's waiting, in progress, done. So we do have to plan, and I'll talk a little bit about planning around user stories next. But I think this is an image, James Wine's high-rise homes. I really like this image as a metaphor for the kind of planning we do in Agile, right? We start with a very sturdy but thin infrastructure, and we fill in as we go along. Kind of an interesting image. So a lot of this stuff, and I'll bring up the image of the book, and we can share that perhaps as a place to put notes after this, comes from a guy named Mike Cohn who wrote the book on user stories. So I'll be referencing him a lot. It's a great book to check out. There's a lot of gems in there. It's a few years old at least, and there's been a lot of progress around thinking of this practice, is employing user stories. But there's still some gold in this book. He talks about what he calls a planning onion, right? So at one level we have organizational strategic planning. This is where do we steer the ship kind of stuff. We're not going to go into that. Not my strong suit. We have portfolio planning. We have a number of simultaneous projects going on. Probably won't go too deep into that today, but it is a level in the planning onion or tree ring. We have product planning. This is likely something people are familiar with. We've got a single product. What are we going to do with that product? Release planning, versioning that product, going along. And then we have iteration planning. Where the rubber hits the road, we've got to bring these stories in. We'll be focusing more on that level, release, iteration, product. And then we have our daily planning. This is our stand-up and sometimes pair programming, things like that. So we're going to kind of focus on these areas here in talking about user stories and how they work in these scopes. All right, so right into it, user stories. So everyone remembers the basic format. As a role, I want this feature so that I derive this business value. Pretty easy to write. We talked about tasks versus features, so I won't go too in-depth there. But a user story is not a task. Straight up, a user story expresses a feature. It may be a very granular feature. It may be a feature that is not necessarily super useful in and of itself. We'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of the webinar. A user story is a finite thing. Think of it as a transaction, right? When it's done, there better be some utility value there in the software for the user. It isn't a technical task. Sometimes we run into scenarios where we need to put cross-cutting concern, or we need to enable something that isn't super valuable to the user, and that's okay. We just, in a real agile team, we want to avoid weighting our iterations with technical tasks. So Mike Cohn has this notion of INVEST. It's an acronym, and it's a really, really valuable thing to keep in mind when you're writing user stories. So we'll go through. I is for independent. User stories should not necessarily express a connection to one another. That is, I shouldn't have two stories that have, if we think about it like a Venn diagram, a union of functionality, so that one story blocks another. Think about your development teams, and say you've got a couple pairs working together. And we actually recently came up against this, where you have two people working on stories that are sharing features, or are dependent on each other. That can cause a block. That can cause an impediment. So you really want your stories to be as independent as possible. It's a big deal. Now, I've seen this a number of times with teams where we'll start, every first feature that we work on in a system is login feature, right, or the sign-up feature. And subsequent stories are dependent on signing up. Say I'll pull an example out of the air. Say we're making like a note-taking system or a blog engine, right? And we have this feature post a blog entry. Well, that is dependent on signing in and actually knowing your identity. That's the fact of the matter. So in reality, we do end up with dependencies, but what we want to try to do is when we kick off a project or when we kick off a release is understand how those dependencies work, where they are, and then sequence our stories in a way so that we don't have dependent stories inside of a given iteration. So dependencies happen. They're real. I wouldn't fret over them too much, but you can do a lot by sequencing what you deliver iteration over iteration. Now, this requires some flexibility on the product ownership side, and we'll get into that a little bit next. Now, a way of dealing with dependencies is this notion of connectors. So say we've got a blog application and we want to, we have a story that's like, as a author, I want to post blog entries so that people can, read about what music I'm into or whatever. And in that post, perhaps we have this notion of category or tag. Let's say category, and let's say that we've kind of envisioned the system to have every post has a single category. Well, you can easily break off a story that's about managing categories or things like that. And in the post story, perhaps what we do is we just have a static list of categories. So we don't have to deal with that. So we're leaving kind of we're leaving a little bit of debt there, but you can kind of trim that off and just not worry about the categories. Oftentimes we'll end up with stories that are like, you've got some feature, some form, and you want to, have a drop-down, category example like that, and then you have management of those categories. Those are areas where we can do the story that's going to end up as a form with a drop-down first if we really want to, if we're optimizing for business value, and then do the management thing later, and then connect the two. So just something to keep in mind. It's kind of an edge technique. I wouldn't, if you can, I try to sequence things for utility at the beginning of a project rather than business value. Ultimately, you have to deliver X amount of business value, but pay attention to how the stories go into the system and try to keep them independent. All right, stories are negotiable. So this one's kind of tricky. For me, the negotiability of the story is really about the fact that it isn't a fully cooked requirement. It isn't a spec that we can measure 100% after we're done. So it's thinking about working with your customer, if you're lucky enough to have an on-site customer or customer proxy or product owner that's working with you to get acceptance on a story. Sometimes we'll negotiate with, as developers or product owners, to say, well, we didn't really initially have this idea in the story, but maybe we should do this. So that may extend the scope of the story. And what I find, or on the developer side, this is going to be kind of complex. If you want us to do it, we may not make the iteration. So the notion that a story is kind of an ever-evolving thing. It is an invitation to have a conversation. It's something that we take in the iteration and then treat as a kind of as a tool for stimulating that conversation, always coming back to it and figuring out what we're meant to deliver, all the way up until the point that we deliver. Okay, stories are valuable. So this is the so that business value part, right? We want to know what value is being delivered by the stories, and I think this is something people often overlook, but it's pretty important to know what's going on. I think with a large backlog of stories, and we'll talk about that in a second, you'll find that the business values tend to stratify. They almost tend to become a category or theme. So know the value you're delivering. Estimable. This one I maybe have some question with on a mature team. We'll talk about that at the end. But a story should be able to, perhaps a better word is scopable. A story should fit into an iteration, and you should have a sense of the difficulty or complexity involved in that story. So what do we use to estimate? Estimation is a whole other ball of wax, but a common technique is ideal days. So this story will take 2 ideal days. I have a problem with ideal days in that I don't know about you, but I experience very few ideal days, and you know, we have meetings sometimes. I'm lucky to have very few meetings here, but I do take lunch from time to time, and there are interruptions. You know, just things that come up, errands, being pulled into some discussion, whatever. So an ideal day is kind of this artificial thing, which is okay because we're about to talk about story points, which are completely artificial. These, when this meme was going around, often were talked about as gummy bears, because a story point is just this ephemeral thing. It is a measure of a story in relation to another story. So you may have something with 1 point and 2 points. The idea is that the 2-pointer should be about twice as difficult. What is difficult? I don't know. As the 1-pointer. The point, I guess, with story points is that you'll ultimately end up with a scenario where there's an implicit understanding of what 1 means. And there's a notion that 1 fits into whatever our iteration size is. So the estimate isn't, the reason I prefer story points is it's not really a contract. It's not really something that you can say, you know, we blew it on this one. We estimated 1, you know, and it was 2, and it's going to come up in your quarterly review or whatever. What you'll find is that there's this thing called Delphi wideband theory, I think, that sometimes you'll miss an estimate, but over the aggregate, the estimate tends to be kind of valuable. Of course, we then take the points that we deliver every iteration, and we look at iteration over iteration to develop a trend line and see where our velocity is going. So after 6, 8, 10 iterations, we can know how many points that we deliver, and we'll miss it sometimes. Sometimes we'll exceed it. But what's important is that kind of average velocity. All right. So triangulation, and the way I understand this is that sometimes you know, we want to go back through our stories that we've completed and say, about how many hours did this take, or about, you know, was this really a 1, things like that. We, at my previous job, we had this thing called the User Story Hall of Fame. It was just a little pegboard that we put up on the wall, and we would periodically, during retrospective, for example, go through our stories and say, you know, this really was a 1. This really was a 2. This really was a 4, whatever numbers that we're using. And pin them up there so that when we were doing an estimation session, we could look at those stories and say, well, this story that we're trying to estimate really kind of goes with this particular 2. You know, these 3 2s that we really believe were 2s. And that can kind of become a nice tool when you're doing your estimation for breaking ties. That can be a nice tool for sometimes we get bogged down in estimation sessions can be pretty long. Talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's a nice way of dealing with the uncertainty of what is a point. One thing I'll just say is if you're trying to roll this out and you're trying to affect change in your organization, don't call them gummy bears. Just call them, you know, points, difficulty points, something. So what I've done in the past is used the Fibonacci sequence to estimate things. So, you know, I guess it would start with 1 if it was a true Fibonacci sequence. So there'd be a very boring Fibonacci sequence. We have we have a number of intervals that we can estimate a story. Infinity probably could start at 8, right? So we want to have a bandwidth of points that will allow into an iteration, because an iteration is a fixed amount of time, and maybe an 8 is not doable. These upper range estimates are useful for stories that are larger in scope, and I'll get into that next. But we want to kind of, you know, have a lower range that we're comfortable keeping our stories at, and this is just a common technique. Right now, at version 1, we use 0, 0.5, 1, 2, and 4. Anything bigger than that, actually anything bigger than a 2, we don't bother with. It's got to be broken down. It's a product ownership fail. Okay, so how do we estimate? Planning poker, this is a pretty common technique where we'll go through, look at all the stories that we have, and then call out a number. And I'm a big fan of using your hand to do that. So you've got your index finger is 1. You throw up your middle finger with your index finger, hopefully, and you end up with a 2. And we just kind of 1, 2, 3 shoot, and then we take the number. Sometimes you'll end up with outliers, right? You'll end up with a person that threw up a 4 and the person that did a 0. Well, in that case, you know, that's their time to discuss why their sense of the difficulty of the story warranted a 4 or a very low estimate. It's pretty easy technique. One thing I've found with this, and that in actually the team I'm working with now, is that we like to go over all the stories that we think could be in this iteration, just to get a sense of the vision of the system, and then as a separate pass, once we're good with that, go and estimate it. This has been really valuable for breaking what maybe you could call estimation lock. And I don't know if other people have experience with this, but sometimes estimation sessions are grueling, long, annoying things. I hate it. But what we found is that we can get a lot of value by segmenting out where we're trying to understand what the intent of the story is, and some of the acceptance tests around the story and things like that from the actually assigning the point value. It works. Okay, stories are small. I hinted at this a little bit, but obviously your story with the estimate needs to fit into your iteration, so you want to keep them in that scope. Going further, I would say smaller stories are better. They obviously tend to take less time, they tend to be simpler, and it's easier to write tests for, things like that. So breaking your stories down to the point where they still are understandable by the business user, ideally the person that wrote the story, is really key to getting the most out of velocity, right? So we're not pursuing velocity, it's just a yesterday's weather kind of thing. But if we can do more small stories, in my experience, your velocity tends to be higher naturally over doing a few large stories, which there's a lot more risk in a large story. Right. So the epic. The epic is a kind of a special type of story. It's a big old story. Now, epics are really useful. Remember the tree rings, right? At a certain level in the planning onion. I think at the product level, they're very useful, and I think at the release level, they can be quite useful. But an epic isn't something that necessarily belongs in the iteration. An epic is simply expressed as a user story, but there's lots of opportunity to break it down. So my previous gig, I was working for a software company that made insurance, claims management, policy management, document management stuff. And this is an example from that. So on the left here, we have, as an underwriter, I want to write a policy so that I can add new business. That's an epic. And then you can see that we have the ability to break that down. Now, when you're breaking things down, I highly recommend, I think this is a deal breaker. If you're not breaking it down with the person that wrote the story, something's going wrong. There's a lot of opportunity to go unilateral in here. There's a lot of opportunity to make false assumptions. So, but the action or the activity of breaking things down is incredibly valuable, and it helps us get to small stories that are deliverable and low risk. All right. Now, one thing I'll just say is just kind of sharing some of the techniques that we use here is our product owners use epics to manage the large feature areas in the system. So obviously we use the version 1 product in-house, and there's a way to manage that, and they can kind of see how we're progressing along in the epic via what's called a parking lot chart, progress meter, that kind of thing. So epics are a valuable tool. You just don't want to see them in your iteration. All right, themes are those big feature areas. Now, what we use themes for internally as a way to express the business value. So that often ends up becoming a theme. And that's so we can kind of look at our progress along the value proposition that we're trying to deliver with our products. Theme simply can think of it as a category. You can think of it as a functional breakdown. I find it really valuable to organize my tests under the theme rather than the story. So we may have a theme in our bank teller application that's like point of sale or vending, right? Whereas all of the stuff is about servicing a customer at, in person in a brick and mortar context. That's I guess all I have to say about themes. Sometimes stories can be too small, and I think the main indicator of a too small story is that it no longer is meaningful to the customer, right? Again, back to the multilateral approach is work with the customer to create these stories, to break them down, things like that, and you should be good. All right, so stories are testable. There was a slide, the done stuff. Yeah, we need to be able to make sure that we're done. And in their story, before we go into iteration, we probably want to have some automated acceptance tests or an expression of an acceptance test that we will automate in the course of delivering the story. There are a number of techniques for doing that. Again, I think it's kind of its own topic. I'll hint on a few ideas, but you don't want to take a story into an iteration just like this, right? You probably want to have some notion of what it means to actually make a deposit. So when making a deposit of $100 into an account with a 0 balance, the new balance, or the balance post-deposit should be $100. So little examples like that. Now, ideally, the user is also writing these acceptance tests, so I would keep them super lean and unintimidating. So these tend to fall in a couple of categories. You end up with an example test or specification. In this case, this is an example, concrete numbers involved, the kind of thing that we can automate with a fit table fixture or something. Rule specifications or tests tend to be more of the, when making a deposit, the balance should increase by the amount of the deposit. I favor the latter. I think they're a little bit more resilient to change, and you end up with less of a spec explosion or a tendency to want to do tons of examples in kind of a generative testing type situation, but keep them, I'm getting super nerdy about tests here, I know. Keep it really simple. That's your best technique. Try to get your users to at least work with you to write them. I think of them as acceptance criteria. I think of tests, automated tests, as what are the statements we can make about this story right now at various points, specifically at iteration planning level, and then throughout, because remember, the story is a living thing. We keep defining it, but can I get 80% of what I would consider acceptance down in some kind of English that everyone can understand? If you can, you're going to have a lot better luck as far as knowing when you're done. Also, I think just to linger on this one a little bit longer, we want to try to automate these things. So we want to use a tool like, there's a number of Selenium, RSpec, NUnit, JUnit. We want to try to find Watton. We want to try to find a way to get these things to run over and over again, so that obviously we get the regression benefit. And if we express ourselves at the acceptance criteria level, we also get some documentation about the behavior of the system. If we have time, I'll go a little bit into a technique called behavior-driven development. So another thing that sometimes that is nice as far as the T, the testable part of the INVEST acronym, is the notion of having wireframes or UX prototypes. So version 1, we have a UX heavyweight, Andy Edmonds, who works with us to make things rational. I would say we all know developers maybe aren't the best, have the best visual aesthetic. So he will say, we have this feature coming up that's going to display so-and-so on the screen. He will do a UX prototype or work with the user experience talent to make that available at the get-go. And that gives you a good sense of what's done. That lets us do some of the UX engineering inside of our iteration, inside of our, when we're working on that story, and everyone's happy. So this is something some shops, I know Jeff Sutherland, I think Patient Keeper, they're big fans of having that UX prototype. That's a safety critical system, so it's one of those things you need to judge for yourself. Is it important to put that level of investment into a story before you start working on it? All right, BDD, I'm going to, I don't know if I could do a 2-minute thing. Yeah, we can come back to it if there are questions. All right, so a couple of things user stories farm. They're not a spike, and they're not research and development. So a spike is a notion of we need to do something that's going to involve technology or some complex business requirements, domain modeling, things like that. And we need to have some time to try to cultivate some expertise or at least some opinion about what we should be doing. We recently put search into our product, and we didn't full-text search, and we didn't know whether to go with Lucene or SQL Server as an example. So we spiked it out, and then we had a story that was the search story that we did with some more confidence. A user story is not a spike. My personal opinion about spikes is spikes should be ephemeral things. You should never spike in code to a production code base. Branch it off, work on it, throw it away. You'll do it better the second time. User stories are not the, what is this, RFC 2119. I remember when I first got started in software, I had a 200-page binder thrown on my desk that was full of must, must not, required, shall not for the system. It was amazing that I survived in this industry and didn't go off and, I don't know, do something else. User stories are not use cases. However, use cases are sometimes, I think, valuable when you have a particularly complicated workflow in your system. Wouldn't necessarily advocate bringing them forth as requirements, although people are getting benefit from this, so I'll hold the value judgment. But use case is this UML notion of you've got all these features and here's who uses them. It may be that place order can be broken down into a story. Notice you have all these dependencies, and we want to think about our independent idea, right? With stories, use cases have this whole semantic model for dealing with dependencies, and it's a good thing. So they're not use cases. You may find a use case, though, that can be broken down to several independent stories. So it is an analysis technique that it's worth looking at. All right, tracking effort. We won't get into that. Version 1 product supports it. I'm not a big fan. If you're in a consulting situation, you don't really have a choice. We will, however, talk about a few things. I think we're kind of closing in on time, and I'd like to take some questions. So just a few ideas that I had that maybe are more edgy is where they come from. So I've had good luck with a customer proxy, product owner, that kind of thing, that writes the stories. And in a product development situation, that's your option, right? Is you are kind of the steward of the product, and it's your call deciding what's going on, but you want to try to incorporate your marketing, awareness and your feedback from customers and things like that. In a on-site development, it's really nice to have access to a domain expert. It's really nice to have access to the end user to write them. Now, to get a few stories in the hopper, I think a workshop is a great way of doing it. I've done it a couple of ways where we take, typically what we end up doing is we'll take 5-10 minutes. We'll start with an expression of the vision of the product and what the main value propositions and why we're doing this. And then everyone takes 5-10 minutes, writes down features, and I wouldn't be super worried about getting them in a story format. Just write down the title of the feature. Then what we do is everyone goes around and we just keep going in circles and say, right, this has got to be a feature in a system, hold up the card, explain it briefly, and then start piling them. Start aggregating them into piles that are, oh, these things are similar, these things are similar. And the next pass, maybe takes half an hour, 40 minutes. The next pass, now start actually harvesting real user stories from those things. I would say if you're lucky, you don't have to have a complete scope of the system. That's, in my experience, kind of a fantasy. If you have trust between the customer and the developer, then we should be able to start working on those most important things and then continue with the workshop. So the workshop is not a big bang event at the beginning, although it does happen at the beginning. A workshop can be a continuous kind of thing that we do, every other iteration or something when we're running an ENIC. A lot of places that's not practical. You need to, in a fixed bid scenario, you need to have a sense of all the stories. You need to estimate them. You need to know what a point costs you, things like that, so you can develop a proposal. So, but a workshop can be useful for working with, clients, customers as clients that are coming to you if you're in that scenario. Large backlog versus rolling wave. So this is a little tangential, but the idea that we're going to have 300 stories in our system, in our backlog, and everyone's going to have an estimate. So we have this perfect knowledge of when everything's going to be done. This is sometimes the product burn down or burn up is a visualization that we use to see this. I'm not a big fan. I think that if you can get away with it, keep what's called a rolling wave. If you Google rolling wave planning, the first hit that comes up is a really interesting kind of white paper about this notion, and that this is what we do at version 1. We take a small stack of stories that maybe in 1.5 iterations worth, and we estimate them. And we don't waste our time estimating stories that may come in, leave inventory, may be ripped up, may be invalidated, may be duplicated. If you have a large backlog, you're going to end up with a lot of waste due to duplicated stories or invalidated stories. So why expend the effort of estimating them? Furthermore, it's rare that we have a complete vision of our system, at the product or even release level sometimes. We know the notes we've got to hit. We know the big opportunities. We know where the ROI is, right? Focus on that in a short-term kind of way. Again, I'm not talking about strategic planning here. That's a whole other ball of wax. Personas. So sometimes we get in this notion where we have as a bank teller. So personas are the notion that you would have Bobby the bank teller, and you would develop a little bit of a backstory, motivations, aspirations, goals of Bobby the bank teller. And this can be useful. I wouldn't go whole hog into it right from the get-go. Think about how many roles you have are servicing with the software you're creating. And really, if you have a few, do you really need to go to the expense of creating and maintaining personas? I'm not sure. In our case, where we have a user experience practice and we have user experience folks, it makes a lot of sense for the products we're developing because we have to communicate with marketing, we have to communicate with development, and by we I mean the UX folks have to get that all out there. And so it is a good practice for us. So it's just something to think about, taking those roles in your stories and harvesting out persona. The biggest thing with user stories, I think, is to always emphasize the essential over the ceremonial. Essence versus ceremonies is something at the core of Agile. You want to make sure you have your, keep your format, keep them small, stick to the INVEST acronym, and express some automated tests. But beyond that, don't get too ceremonial or worked up about these things. Obviously gauge what's needed for your environment, but we can invest in this inventory of stories, the backlog of stories, and maybe be over-investing or wasting time and money. Abandoning estimation. This is something I'm kind of obsessed with right now. My last job, we didn't estimate stories. We estimated, we had, I guess what you could call a binary estimate. The story is small enough to do, or it is not. This is a notion of, in the lean scene, they call this similar sized items, right? Where everything's kind of similar size. Now, this means that you are investing more at the product ownership level in the stories. This makes a lot of sense for version 1 because we have a high ratio of project owners and user experience people and people that are thinking about the product constantly, and that is their job. So when it gets time to develop, we have a fairly known and finite thing, and we kind of know what done is. So this is just something that, I think that the notion of every story approaching an estimate of 1, and now we don't really need to estimate, we just need to simply say, yeah, we can do that. This in my experience is a feature of a mature team. This is not something you want to necessarily pursue from day 1. Tasks, along with the above, is that sometimes when we bring a story into our iteration planning, we'll break it down into what the technical tasks are. Now, this can be useful. This can help us know where things are going. But I find when you start to combine user stories with things like pair programming, you always have a pair that reminds you of what you should be working on. So task breakdown might be a little bit of a waste. Again, it might not. I think task breakdown is something, when a team is gelling, is a very good thing in my experience. In a team that's been working together for 2 years and hardcore XP ninjas, task breakdown might be a waste. I mean, by task breakdown, I don't know if I was clear about this, but the notion that during iteration planning, we're actually going to break down our stories. What we've found is we may end up with 3 or 4 stories in our iteration. We keep pulling stories in as we need. We break down when we go to work on a story. So we may have a few stories in there. Let's say we've got 5 stories and we've got 3 pairs working on it. Then we'll only break down those 3 immediate stories. So kind of just-in-time task breakdown. And then lastly, last point I want to bring up, thanks for sticking with me, is what happens to the story when we're done. And my humble opinion, I think we rip it up and throw it in the trash. In the version 1 tool, you close it and it goes away. You can still get back to it, but it's basically out of your mind. I really like that idea. I like the idea that the acceptance tests that we write are the artifact that we keep, and we don't worry about story as a point of traceability. We worry about developing our themes, our functional breakdown, putting our tests under that functional breakdown, and then slowly improving our testing practice to the point where our tests start to, I've got a slide for this, maybe very deep into the deck, but we start to feed 2 birds with 1 seed. That is, our tests give us confidence that the code's working, and they also give us documentation at the user level of what it does, its behaviors. So I think I'm pretty much done. This is all I can say about user stories. for now. I'll take some questions, I guess.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. It was a really great presentation. One of the questions we have right now is, what criteria do you use to identify an epic?
Well, if you get into estimation and someone, you said 20, that's definitely an epic. An epic is just a very large story, and it's something you can't get done in a iteration. Another way of trying to understand whether or not you have an epic is to say, can we break this down further with the person that wrote it? Epics tend to come off in the Agile community as kind of a bad thing. We use epics here as a tool for breaking things down, but also understanding how we're doing at that epic level. Because, our CEO likes to see things at a very high value level. And then we have, a whole product team that participates at different levels in the delivery of a feature. So we use epics, and the tool supports this very well to kind of keep track of where something was broken down. I don't know. I think that's probably.
Okay, thanks for that. Somebody also wanted to learn a little bit more. Were you saying you might touch on BDD?
Yeah. Well, maybe we can do another webinar.
Okay, we can do that.
The idea with BDD is, this is a BDD deck, is that I hinted on, I don't know if there's a succinct slide that really pulls this up. BDD is kind of a testing practice, behavior-driven development, where we think about the behaviors that we're putting into our code. And oftentimes, those behaviors kind of can be like the acceptance test. Yeah, there's nothing in here. Can be like, they are the acceptance test. They say the system, when you deposit $10 into an account, the balance increases by $10. So if I wrote this example in kind of a BDD, a quick example, so don't judge my BDD food here, but this is oftentimes a way, this is how BDD is done, right? So we have a context and we have a specification. Sometimes you'll hear it as given, when, then. The given and the when are just the context. All context is the state of the world and the event that triggers a behavior or an observation that we can make. So BDD is simply a way of writing really language-oriented tests. And ideally, if BDD borrows from the PDD thing, so ideally we're writing that specification first so that our design is very clean. And it's a huge, huge topic. But for me, BDD is a way of taking a story, staying close to the story rather than going off in a corner, becoming all solution-minded and nerdy, right? Staying close to the story and decompiling it and having that story just kind of meld with our code.
Good. Someone made a comment that your description of the epic breakdown was really good. Do you have any other tips for keeping the business value while reducing the scope of the story so that it fits within an iteration?
I don't know. I mean, I think just staying mindful of it. Let me look at. Yeah, you can see so that I can add new business. I mean, I guess that's a really good question. I've never really thought of it that way. But as we're breaking down the feature, we're also breaking down the business value. Now, you could carry that over, but for some reason when I wrote this, these examples, which are kind of taken from reality, maybe a little simplified, but you can see that now we're getting at a lower, we're getting at a more specific value proposition. I think just be mindful of it. I don't really have any tips. I did this unconsciously. I just think that as we start to talk about more granular features, we may also be talking about more granular value propositions or business values. Now, one thing, we use the version 1 tool, we use themes to have our kind of meta level business value proposition stuff. And so the way we do stories is we still have a so that, and that might veer off from the theme, and that's totally fine. I think these all kind of roll up to the idea that you can add new business, make more money.
Very good. We've got a few more minutes. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to type those in. And if not, we can go ahead and wrap up.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time.